We are on DAF Nun Amid Aleph, or actually on the very bottom of Mem Tes Amid Beis, Itmar, and I just want to bring us up to date. We were talking about, contextually, we're talking about the right of a woman to collect property from her husband. The Mishnah had told us she's only allowed to collect from Ziboris. Mar Zutra made a controversial statement and said that which the Mishnah says that she can only collect from Ziboris is only true if she's collecting from Yisomim. But if she's collecting from her husband directly in cases of divorce, she collects Beinanis. That's actually going to be refuted in just a minute. But in the context of that discussion, we had invoked a discussion of the concept of Arev. Now, there are two types of Arev that the Gemara discusses over here. An Arev simply means a guarantor on a debt or on a loan. A person can act as a guarantor such that if the debtor defaults on his debt, the creditor can go to the guarantor. But we saw a very strange statement yesterday from the Gemara. The Gemara had said that when it comes to a ksuva, a guarantor cannot be sued in a Beis Din. Even if he says, I'm a guarantor, she will not be able to collect if he refuses to pay. And it wasn't clear why, but now the Gemara is going to explain why. And the difference, the distinction that the Gemara had said is with the other type of guarantor, which is an Arev Kablan. A Kablan is a situation where not only does the person verbally or in writing commit himself to be a guarantor, but he actually takes the money that is being given to the borrower and holds it in his hand and returns it back to the borrower. In other words, he actually takes the money from the creditor, puts it in the hand of the debtor, so he's actually part of the transaction. And in that situation, the Gemara says he does rise to the level of obligation even more so than a regular Arev, because there's actually been a physical exchange of cash that has passed through his hands. That's what's called a kablan. So now the Gemara says, Itmar, Arev diksuva divrei hakol lo mishtabe. Everyone agrees that if a person is an Arev on a ksuva, just a regular Arev, then he cannot be sued in Beis Din. In other words, if he says, well, your husband defaulted on the ksuva, sorry lady, I know I acted as a guarantor, but I wasn't serious, and we'll see why in just a minute, we don't hound him to pay the guarantee. Kablan de Baal Chov, Divrei HaKol Mishtabe. Everyone agrees that if you want to be a guarantor on a Kablan level, which means that the creditor extends the money to the Kablan, and the Kablan puts it in the hands of the debtor, so he's part of the transaction of the loan, let's say, then in that situation, everyone agrees that he can actually indebt himself and be sued in Beis Din and be forced to pay up in the case when the debtor defaults on the loan. That everyone agrees. However, Arev de Balchov, the Kablan de Ksuva, but what about the two middle cases? What about a regular guarantor on a loan? Does a regular guarantor who did not exchange cash, can he be sued in Beis Din and forced to pay? And our second question is, what about a kablan on a ksuva? What about a man who actually takes money that is taken from the husband before he pays out the ksuva? They're getting married now. The husband takes cash, puts it in the hand of the kablan, and the kablan puts it in the woman's hands. And she gives it back to her husband. In that situation, where he's been part of this exchange of cash, does that rise him to the level of that he can be sued in Beis Din, and if the husband defaults on the payment of the ksuv at the termination of the marriage?
It's just ceremonial, really.
It's more than, but it's a halachic mechanism that's being enacted. You can say a kinyan is ceremonial, but we know it's not. It's a mechanism that changes the halachic reality.
Yeah.
So when you're a kablan, you're changing the halachic reality, because instead of just making a commitment that's ethereal, you're actually making a commitment that's based upon your relinquishing of cash that was given to you, and you're saying, here it is back, and now I'm placing myself on the hook for that money. Okay? So that's really the issue. You've received the money, and you're giving it now to the debtor, so you're part of that loan, right? So that's the question, will that work for a ksuva? So the Gemara says this is a machlokes. Ikal aman do amar afal gav de lesle nichs leloive mishtabed, ve'ikal aman do amar isle mishtabed lesle lo mishtabed. There's a machlokes. Some rabbis hold that you can act as a guarantor on a loan without being a kablan, and if you're a kablan on a ksuva, you also are on the hook. But it only is going to work if the debtor that you're acting as a guarantor from has real assets, owns real estate. Because in that situation, then we take your guarantee seriously. We take your assumption of guarantee as a serious assumption. Why? Because psychologically you're saying to yourself, the risk that I'm going to have to pay back this guy's loan are minimal because he has real estate assets, and therefore if he defaults on the loan, the creditor will be able to take away his real estate, and therefore my assumption of risk is minimal, and I'm willing to assume that minimal risk, that in the event that the real estate is no longer usable or no longer has value to pay the loan, I'm willing to assume that risk. But those rabbis hold that in a situation where the debtor has no assets to speak of at all, and it's basically an unsecured loan, or it's an unsecured commitment, so in that situation, we don't take an Arev's guarantee seriously on a loan, and we don't even take a Kablan's commitment seriously on a ksuva. Now, why is there a difference between a ksuva and a regular loan? It's very simple. In the ksuva, who's the creditor and who's the debtor? Think about it for a second. In a ksuva, who's the creditor? The wife. Who's the debtor? The husband. Now, in the case of a regular loan, the creditor is out of pocket, and if he's not paid back, well, then that's wrong. He extended $1,000 in a loan to the debtor, and the guarantor, therefore, if he's going to assume that responsibility, he should have to pay, right? But what about a woman who is promised a ksuva? She's a creditor, but has she extended anything of herself? There's no out-of-pocket expenses. She's promised that at the termination of the marriage, she'll get $1,000 or whatever the amount is, right? So she's not extending. She doesn't incur any out-of-pocket expenses that we have to make her whole. She's just not gaining what was promised to her, the debt that was promised to her. And therefore, the Chachamim did not place the same onus upon a guarantor for a ksuva as they did for other things. And furthermore, as we're going to see in a minute, there's another argument to be made by a ksuva why we're going to go easy on a guarantor. So the Gemara now says, so this is a machlokes. Some say that in those two middle cases, an arev on a regular loan and a kablan on a ksuva, it doesn't matter whether the debtor has real estate or not, it works. And some say that it only works, that a guarantor will only commit himself in a case, seriously commit himself, in a case where the debtor has real estate. The hilchas of bekulu afal gav the lesle mishtabe. And the halacha in all of these cases is that even when the debtor has no real estate assets, an arev works on a regular loan, and a kablan works on a ksuva. Bar me arev de ksuva, de afal gav de isle lo mishtabe. And the only exception is if a person is a regular arev, right, without doing that exchange of cash, and he acts as a guarantor in a ksuva, even in a case where the husband owns real estate, the arev is not taken seriously and therefore cannot be sued and based in. Why? My taima mitzvahu da'avid v'lo midi chasros. The Gemara gives two arguments. The second one is because there's no out-of-pocket expenses for her. But the first reason that the Gemara gives is, you know what? The guy's doing a mitzvah. He sees that this poor guy wants to marry the girl, and she says, well, I need a guarantee that I'm going to be paid the ksuva upon termination of the marriage, or I'm not going to marry you. And this guarantor, Nebuch, the friend, says, oi, I want this nice couple to get married. It's a mitzvah for two people to get married. Bring them to the chuppah. All right, I'll act as the guarantor. If that's what will bring him to the chuppah, I'll do it. But then at the time of payment, he says, I wasn't serious. I just wanted to get them, want to get them married. So therefore, we don't take him seriously for that reason. Omar Ravina, Toshma meikora de takantin yosem imashish rotza lisa isha rotza linase. The Ital kadaitach miyasme haimishum diyasmehu? Question mark. Now we're going back to Mar Zutra's statement that I started off the morning with. What did Mar Zutra say? Mar Zutra had said that the only time that a woman can only collect from ziboris is if she's collecting from yasomim. But if she's collecting from the husband directly, she collects beinanis. Comes along the Gemara and says, but wait a minute, we learned in the Brisa at the very outset of this discussion that the reason why a woman only gets ziboris is because she's more desperate to get married than a man. And based on that, we don't have to promise her the moon. She'll be satisfied with ziboris as long as she can get married. Well, if that's the case, says the Gemara, then why should that only apply to Yisomim? That should apply to when she's getting paid by the husband directly. So the Gemara answers, to Yufta de Marzutra, to Yufta. Is this a refutation of Marzutra? Yes, it is. And therefore we reject Marzutra's assertion that this halacha only applies in cases of Yisomim. It applies even when she's collecting from the husband directly after a divorce. Next, Omar Marzutra Bereder Rav Nachman Mishmeder Rav Nachman. Now here's another statement that Marzutra made in the name of his father Rav Nachman. Shtar choiv hayotze al hayisomim, afal pi shekasav bo shevach eno gova elamin haziboris. Now we learned in our Mishnah that when you collect from Yisomim, you can only collect from Ziboris. Comes along Marzutra and says, you want to know something? This is true even if it says in the Shtar Chov, in the promissory note, explicitly that the creditor has rights to collect from Idis. Even if it says that explicitly, nevertheless, if the debtor dies and you're going to collect from the Yisomim, you can only collect from Ziboris. So Amar Abaye Teda, Abaye says, I'll prove it to you from the standard halacha. De Balchov dine bebeininis umiyashlim beziboris. He says, we know that there's a halacha that's implicit in every loan, that when a creditor wants to collect his debt, if he's going to collect from real estate, he gets to collect from Beinanis, from that middle level of quality. Now, and yet, so it's as if, since it's implicit in every loan, it's as if it's written in the shtar. And yet, when he comes to collect from the Yisomim, instead of the debtor himself, he can only collect from Ziboris. So this proves that even though something is written explicitly in the shtar that I can collect from Idis, when you're collecting from Yisomim, you can only collect from Ziboris. So Amarle Rava Hachi Hashta. So Rava says to Abaya, enter Marzutra, I'm sorry, I disagree. He says, in a situation where Bal Chov Dina Midioraisa B'Ziboris Kidaula, Do Amar Ula Dvar Torah Bal Chov B'Ziboris. He says, I'm sorry, that's not a good analogy. In a situation where a person extends a loan and it's implicit that he gets to collect from Beinanis, that's not a biblical law. That's a rabbinic law. Because biblically, midioraisa, what is the right of a creditor? Only to collect ziboris. How do we know this? Shenemar b'chutz tamod ve'oish v'goimer. Ma darko shel ish lahotzi pachosh shebekelim. He says, look in the Torah. The Torah says that when you lend someone money and you want to collect collateral, the Torah requires you as the creditor to stand outside and let the debtor bring out whatever kli he wants to present as collateral for payment. Now, what does that indicate? Who gets to choose what form of payment he wants to make? It's the debtor, it's not the creditor. Now, when someone gets to choose what form of payment they want to make, what kind of kli is the debtor going to bring outside? He'll bring the least expensive kli outside, the lowest quality kli, because that's the one he'd rather unload first. So you see very clearly from the Torah that midioraisa, a creditor is only entitled to ziboris. Why then? Umatam amru balchov bebeinanis kadei shalotinol delis bifnei lovim. And therefore, it's only a rabbinic law that the rabbi said that a creditor, even though the Torah only entitles him to ziboris, we're going to award him beinanis. Why? To incentivize people to lend money, right? If that's the case, then I could argue like this. In a case of a non-explicit loan where it doesn't say in the shtar how the guy's going to collect, it's only a rabbinic accommodation that he collects from Beinanis. So when he's collecting from Yisomim, the rabbis remove the rabbinic accommodation and put the law back on the Deoraisa level that he only collects from Ziboris. But over here, Allahacha kevin dedina mi Deoraisa be'idis, afilu mias minami be'idis. But argues Rava, but when you write explicitly in the shtar that the creditor has rights of collection from Idis, so then midioraisa, since you've written the shtar that way, two consenting adults can structure a loan any way they want. And if they've structured the loan that the creditor will collect from Idis, then midioraisa, the creditor is entitled to Idis. So argues Rava, in that case, where it's explicit in the shtar, he can collect Idis from the Yisomim. It's only when it's implicit does he collect Ziboris from the Yisomim. But if it's explicit in the shtar, then he does collect Idis from the Yisomim. Rava. So now the Gemara says, okay, we have this machlokis between Marzutra and Rava, right? Let's ask a kasha on Rava. V'hatani Avram Choza'a eini from enichse yasomim elamin iziboris v'afilu heini zakin. There's a brisa that was taught by Avram Choza'a. The brisa says that when you collect from yasomim, you can only collect from ziboris, even if the person collecting from the yasomim is an injured or damaged party. Now, when we talked about cases of damage, what's the law? You collect from what? Idis. And yet, even though he's entitled to Idis, and the Torah entitles him to Idis, right? Remember we learned that from Meitav Sadehu? From the best quality, the Nizik is allowed to collect. And yet, even though the Torah awards him Idis, you still can only collect from the Yisomim Ziboris. So it's a kasha on you, Rava. Here you see it's the Torah law that is downgraded, not just the rabbinic law. V'hanizaken dinan midioraisa be'idis. Yeah, that's the question. So the Gemara answers, Hacha b'mayaskinan Kegon shahaisa idis denizik is iboris demazik v'Rabbi Shmuel. He da'omer midioraisa b'denizik shaimin and mipnei tikkun holam takina rabbanan b'demazik v'gabe yasim yukmu rabbanan adioraisa. So the Gemara answers no. The case of that brisa is where the highest quality of land that is owned by the nizik is equivalent to the ziboris, the lowest quality land of the mazik. Now we learned that according to Rabbi Yishmael, in that situation, the Torah really says that the mazik can pay from his ziboris because it's equivalent to the idis of the nizik. And we use the nizik standards to determine what idis means. Meitav Sadehu means the best quality of the nizik's property, not the best quality of the mazik's property. The rabbis added to that, and they said that no, we're going to require paying the idis standard of the mazik, not the idis standard of the nizik. But when it comes to paying Yisomim, the rabbis removed their rabbinic accommodation and put it back on Torah law. So Rava says this is not a challenge to me. This is where, by all rights, the Yisomim pay Ziboris because that's equivalent to the Idis of the Nizik. Okay, so now the Gemara says, Aini, is this really so? Again, we're going to ask from another brisa. V'hatani, Rabbi Eliezer Niyota'a, this Rabbi Eliezer brings another brisa which says, Ein nifroin minichse Yisomim, ela min haziboris va'afilu hein idis. It's a bit cryptic what this means, but when you collect from the Yisomim, you can only collect ziboris, even if they are idis. Now, what does that mean? My afilu hein idis, lav afal gav dichsiv idis bishtara. Doesn't that imply, even when the promissory note explicitly says idis, that the creditor shall collect from idis, nonetheless, when you're collecting from Yisomim, you can only collect ziboris, and that's a kasha on Rava. So the Gemara says, lo, my idis shafoi idis kiderava. We're talking about idis that was ruined. Now, let's explain the law. In other words, really says Rava, in a situation where the creditor structured the loan such that if you, the debtor, default on the loan, you're going to have to pay me from the idis of your property. And let's say the debtor had 3 fields. He had an idis field, he had a beinunis field, and he had a ziboris field. What happened was that after the loan, the idis field got geschmettered. Something happened to it. It got wiped out through a blight, a flood, something, an earthquake. Something happened to it, and it's no longer usable. All he's got left is his beinunis field and his ziboris field. Now, from the Torah standpoint, the only thing that was guaranteed to the creditor was that idis field. Now, by rabbinic law, however, he's now entitled to collect from the beinunis field. But midioraisa, he is now only entitled to collect from the ziboris field. That's what the brisa says, that when you collect from Yisomim in that case, where the idis field that the creditor had identified in the loan is destroyed, don't give him the beinunis, give him the ziboris, because he's collecting from the Yisomim and not from the debtor himself. The Amar Rava, hizik ziboris, goiva min ha'idis, shafoi idis goiva min ha'beinunis, v'gabe yasim yukmu rabbanan adioraisa. That Rava had said a standard halacha, that even if the mazik damages the ziboris of the nizik is still entitled to the idis of the mazik. But in a situation where the idis of the mazik is destroyed, or a debt that is incurred by the debtor, where the land was identified, the idis land was identified as the collateral, and it was destroyed, you would then be goiva, the creditor would be goiva from the beinunis. But by Yisomim, we put it back on the Torah level, and it's only ziboris. Okay, let's go weiter. Ein nifroin minichse Yisomim. So if you haven't been listening up until now, because you've been preoccupied, this is a good time to jump back in. Ein nifroin minichse yisomim ela min haziboris. So the Mishnah says, going back to, the Mishnah had said that when you collect from yisomim, you only collect from ziboris. Boy rav ach debuye bar ami. Yisomim sha'amru ketanim wafilu gedolim. Here's our question. Remember, I had alluded to this ambiguity yesterday. When the rabbis made an accommodation that when you collect from yisomim, you can only collect ziboris, is this an accommodation to minor yisomim? These little orphan kids, they're looking up with their big eyes and they have no one to turn to. So we make an accommodation that if they're debtors, the creditor can only collect from their ziboris. Or does it apply to the 50-year-old slick businessmen on Wall Street who now have collected their father's estate? Can they too claim, we only have to pay ziboris? The question is, what is the reason for the rabbinic accommodation? That's the question. Takantihi da'avid rabbanan gabi yasmi l'ketani avid rabbanan l'gedolim lo avid rabbanan. So on the one hand, you could argue, we want to help these poor little yisomim who are defenseless and need some help. So therefore, it's only accommodation for minors. It's not an accommodation for adults who are savvy. O Dilma, or maybe look at it another way. Mishum delo masik adaita de malve de misloive venafli nifsi kameyasmi de havali noel deles hilka chafilu gedoilam nami. What was the whole reason that we said that a creditor can normally collect from Beinanis on a loan? Really, we said that midioraisa he's only entitled to ziboris. But what's the reason we said he's entitled to collect from Beinanis? Because shalotin ol deles bifnei lovin. We don't want to close the door. We don't want to disincentivize people from lending money. We want to incentivize them. So we say if you lend money, you'll always get back Beinanis. That for sure you'll be able to get back. But if that's the psychology, what is the lender going to be thinking in his mind? When a lender lends money, he works under the assumption that the borrower will be alive at the time of the repayment of the loan. People don't lend money with the fear that the borrower is going to die. They generally lend money with the assumption, okay, it's a short-term loan, whatever it is, you'll pay it back, right? So if he's not thinking about the contingency of the borrower dying, then we don't have to worry about making that accommodation for Yisomim, because it's not part of his psychology. His fear is only that I'm going to get Ziboris from this living guy. I don't want to lend him money if I'm going to get Ziboris. So, but if I know I'm going to get Beinanis from him, and I'm not even thinking about what's going to happen after he dies, the rabbis didn't have to worry about that, and they put it back on the Deoraisa, that from Yisomim you're only entitled to collect Ziboris, which is the biblical law to begin with. Maybe that's the way you look at it, and therefore it doesn't matter whether Yisomim are children or adults. So Tashma, the Tani Abaye Kshisha, Yisomim Sha'amru Gedoilim, Vein Tzarech Lomer Ketanim. So Abaye presents a brayso that says that the Yisomim in halacha are both adults and children, and certainly they are children as well. But wait a minute, v'dil mahani mili le'inyan shvua, de gadol b'mili diavua kekatan damya, but le'inyan ziburis, lo. 1 second, maybe that brayso is not talking about the laws of ziboris. Maybe that brayso is talking about another law that the rabbis instituted, that whenever you want to collect money from the estate of Yisomim, you have to first take a shvua. And on that, the rabbi said, it makes no difference whether the Yisomim are adults or minors, because the whole reason for the Shavua is because the Yisomim say, we didn't lend you money, we have no idea what our father's dealing was with you. It's true you have a shtar chov, you have a promissory note, but how do we know that father didn't pay you already? That's why the rabbi said, it doesn't matter whether they're adults or children. They're like children in the sense that they're totally ignorant of what transpired and what didn't transpire. So therefore, that's why we require a creditor to take a shvua in all cases when he's collecting from Yisomim, even if they're adults. But maybe as far as the law of Ziboris, which is to perhaps accommodate defenseless children, maybe it only works for children but not for adults. And what's the final halacha? Yisomim sha'amru gedolim vein tzarech lomer ketanim vein l'shvua vein l'ziboris. That the halacha is this accommodation was made for both adults and minors who are Yisomim. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking about the law of taking a shvua or the law of the rights of collection only from ziboris. That law is uniform for all Yisomim regardless of their age. We got to go weiter. Ein nifra min achasim mishubadim b'makom sheyesh b'nei chorin. The Mishnah had then said as follows. If a person is defrauded in a sale, let's say Shimon sells Reuven the Brooklyn Bridge, Okay, Reuven didn't know. He thought the Brooklyn Bridge was available and it belonged to Shimon, so he buys the Brooklyn Bridge from Shimon. Comes along the state of New York, or the city of New York, whoever owns it, and says, sorry, the bridge is ours. They take back the bridge. But in the meantime, Reuven had invested all of these things into the Brooklyn Bridge, and he had grown things from the Brooklyn Bridge. He had put in building improvements into the Brooklyn Bridge, and now it's worth 50% more than what it was worth originally. So not only does Reuven have the right to collect the damages of the original purchase price from Shimon, but he can even extract from him all of the appreciation that he was able to accrue from that property that he now loses. He can go back to Shimon and demand payment. With one distinction, says the Mishnah, from the original purchase price, he can even take from him encumbered property, which means if Shimon has no assets because he sold it all, Reuven can go to Shimon's buyers and seize those assets because he says, I was in line first. I was defrauded by Shimon before he sold you that property, so that property was committed to me before he sold it to you. So therefore, it's mine. I'm first on line. But when it comes to the improvements, the appreciation that takes place, and the payros that grew on that Brooklyn Bridge, whatever it is, he can only collect from Shimon property that's unencumbered, that has not been already sold off to somebody else. Which gives rise to the Gemara's next question. Boy ravach debui bar ami b'matana heich takantehu da'avid rabbanon mishum pseida de lukuchos avol matana de lakapseida de lukuchos lo o dilma matana nami ilav de islay hanami ne lo yoiv le matana v'hilkach ki pseida de lukuchos dami. The question is, what if Shimon didn't sell property after selling the Brooklyn Bridge to Reuven, but rather he gave away property as gifts to his friends? Would the accommodation that Reuven has no rights to seize those assets for the improvements still apply? Or, because it's a gift is just like a sale in the sense that I only give people gifts I only give gifts to people who I owe some sense of debt to anyway, so there's been some kind of accommodation that this person gave me that made me want to give him a gift, so he's like a buyer? Or would you say no? The rabbis only made this accommodation to buyers because they now assume an out-of-pocket loss also. Nebuch, the buyer of the Shimon's field, didn't know that he had already committed the Brooklyn Bridge, or even if he knew, he didn't realize that there were going to be appreciation costs as well. So therefore, the rabbis didn't want to burden buyers, the future buyers from Shimon. But maybe when it comes to people who received gifts and they're not going to incur any out-of-pocket loss because they didn't pay money for the gift, they just received it as a gift, maybe the rabbis would allow Reuven to extract his appreciation costs even from encumbered property. That's the question. So the Gemara says, let's look at the following brisa and be able to see if we can infer anything from it. A guy's on his deathbed and he makes the following final will and testament. He says, give $200 to Reuven, give $300 to Shimon, give $400 to Levi. Ein omrim kol hakoydim bishtar zacha. So we don't say that there's a sequential order that he's assigning. He's not saying first Reuven, second Shimon, third Levi. He's saying give him this much, give him this much, give him this much. So they're all considered to be recipients at the same time. And what's the nafkamina? Lefichach yatza lav shtar choiv goyva mikulan. Therefore, if Yehuda comes along and he says, I am a creditor of this shchiv meirah, and I'm entitled to extract the properties from you guys. Let's say, for example, the debt was for $600 that Yehuda comes along with. So Reuven got 200. Levi, sorry, it was for $800. I'm sorry, my math is a little bit off. Reuven got 200. Levi got $300, $900. Let's say the guy says, all right, let's go even higher. Let's go say Yehuda comes along and says the debt is for $900. Fine. So the halacha is, since they're all simultaneous giftees, when Yehuda extracts the money from all of them, he extracts, let's say, the gift. I'll say it even better. let's say the debt was for $900, and root was, or let's say it was for $90. Okay, it was for $90. I am owed $90. There's no more assets in the Shchiv Meira's estate. He divested it all to you guys. So I'm owed $90. So each one has to pay a percentage from their estate to make the guy good for $90. So each one will have to pay 10% of what they received as a gift from the Shchiv Meira. So the guy who got $200 will have to pay 20. The guy who got $300 will pay 30, and the guy who got $400 will pay 40. Okay, that's the way it works, because they're all receiving the gift simultaneously. Avolim Omer Tnu Mosayim Zuz Leploni Ve'acharav Leploni Ve'acharav Leploni Omrim Kol HaKoydem B'Shtar Zacha Lefichach Yatsa Lav Shtar Choyv Goyva Min HaAcharon Ein Lo Gova Mishel Lefanav Ein Lo Gova Mishel Lifnei Fanav. So therefore it works like this. In a situation, however, when the Shchiv Meira assigned sequence to the gifts, he said, first I want you to give 200 to Reuven. Then I want you to give 300 to Shimon. Then I want you to give 400 to Levi. In that situation where he said it's a sequential thing, so the last person to receive the gift is the first on line for the creditor to go to, because he's the last one. All of the property that was encumbered before him is last on line. So if the creditor comes along with a $90 debt, he can collect it all from the last guy who was given $400. And if there's not enough in his gift, then you go to the guy before him. And if there's not enough in his gift, then you go to the guy before him. The afal gav de kama beinanis ubasra ziboris miziboris gavi mi beinanis lo gavi. And that's true. You know what? That's true even if the first giftee got beinanis, which is normally what a bal choiv is entitled to. Even if the first guy got a gift of beinanis and the second guy or the last guy got a gift of ziboris, the creditor has to go to the last guy first, because he's the property that was b'nei chorin last, right? So therefore you go to him first to collect the debt. So what do we want to infer from this? We see from here that the rabbis made an accommodation that you can only collect from unencumbered property first. If there's any encumbered property, you can only collect from unencumbered property first. We see that the accommodation is made even when the encumbered property became encumbered through a gift. We see that there's no distinction between whether it was a gift or whether it was given as a sale. So that's proof, says the Gemara, that there's no difference between gifts and sales. When a guy wants to recoup his losses from the Brooklyn Bridge, it doesn't matter whether Shimon, who sold him the Brooklyn Bridge, sold off his property or gave away his property. There's no distinction made in halacha. So the Gemara says that's not necessarily so, because hacha b'mayaskinan b'ba'al chov. Maybe the Brisa over there is talking about where the Shchiv Meira is not giving gifts to Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. He's paying off his debts to Reuven, Shimon, and Levi, and he says, I owe Reuven $200. Give him $200. I owe Shimon $300. I owe Levi $400. That's what he means to say. It's not gifts. So you can't infer anything from here. But the Gemara says, but wait a minute, v'hatanuka amar. But he said give. Doesn't give mean give him a gift? No, tanu b'chovi. No, he means to say give because I need to pay him back. So frak the Gemara v'lechsi shtar deman kadim. Well, wait a minute. If you're talking about where Reuven, Shimon, and Levi are creditors, they're not just giftees, then why do you look at the language of the Shchiv Meira to determine who's on line first and who's on line last? As for Yehuda, the earlier creditor, just look at whose shtar chov, look at whose promissory note is dated first. That should be the criterion. So the Gemara answers the leka shtara, because we're talking about loans that were made orally. There is no shtar chov, and therefore the only criterion that we can use to determine who's on line first is to see who was given the money last in the Shchiv Meira's oral instructions. But the Gemara says, V'ha kol hakoydem b'shtar ka'amar. But the Gemara says, but wait a minute, doesn't it say that whoever's first in the shtar? That's what the language of the Bryce is. So how can you tell me that there's no promissory note? There is a shtar. The Gemara answers, b'shtar pakadata. It's not talking about the promissory notes of Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. It's talking about that's what happened was the Shchiv Meira instructed someone, write this down in a shtar, first give to Reuven, then give to Levi, Shimon, and then give to Levi. That's the shtar that we're talking about. So you use that shtar as the criterion to see whoever's listed last is the first one that the older creditor can go to. The ibayis ema, I'll give you another teretz, says the Gemara. Afilu matana velo kasha, my goiva min ha'acharon, ein nifsad ela acharon. Says the Gemara, really I'll argue that we're talking about where the Shchiv Meira is giving a gift to Reuven, Shimon, and Levi, but you can't infer from here that gifts have the same thing as sales, because what are we talking about? Really, in reality, when the creditor, Yehuda, comes along and he says, I want to extract, he does have a right to go first to Reuven, even though Reuven was the giftee first. He can go first on line to Reuven, because you know why? Because Reuven got Beinanis, and the other guy got Ziboris, so he does have a right to go to Reuven first. But when the Brisa says that the guy that's going to lose out is the Acharon, is the last guy, it doesn't mean because the creditor gets to go to the last guy. It means because once the creditor takes the money from Reuven's gift, Reuven can turn around and say, I'm out of pocket a gift. I get to go to the guy who got the gift afterwards and take it from him, because I'm first in line to receive gifts from the decedent. And therefore he can go back to the last guy and say, fine, I had to pay the creditor for my Beinanis. Now you give me your Ziboris gift that you got from the Shchiv Meira, because I'm entitled to it first. That's what the Brisa means. Yes, the creditor will take the land from Reuven because he only got it as a gift. But that entitles Reuven to turn around and take it away from Shimon or from Levi. Another explanation could be is that the reason why the creditor has a right to go to Reuven or Shimon or Levi, and we tell him Dafka go to the last guy, is because all of the properties are equivalent in quality. All of them are Beinanis, or all of them are Idis, and in that situation, there's no reason for him to go to the first guy. If Levi got the property gifted to him last, then even though by gifts a creditor does have a right to collect from the Beinanis that was gifted first, nevertheless, in this situation where all of the property quality are equivalent, then when all things are the same, you should definitely go to the last guy first, even when cases of gifts. Weiter. Ein motziin lachilas peiros. The Mishnah had also told us that when a man gets married, he has an obligation automatically, it's part of the ksuva, to feed his wife and to feed the children that the wife brings, the daughters that the wife brings into the marriage. If, let's say, she's an almana or a gerusha, and she brings in daughters into the marriage, part of the terms of the ksuva is that he has to provide for them. However, if, let's say, he has no money, so you don't have a right to go to the encumbered property that he's already sold off to purchase mizonos. That's another thing that the Mishnah had said. My timer, what's the reason? Because it's not written in the shtar. Now, by the way, this is also true when we said Ein motziin la'achilas peros l'shevach karkos, that achilas peros means also what we were just talking about before, is that let's say a guy purchases the Brooklyn Bridge and lets it appreciate in value. So that's what we said. We said that ein motziin lachilas peros, that he can't go back to Shimon and take the encumbered property that Shimon has already sold off. So what's the reason? Because lefi she'ein ksufin, because it's not recorded. It's one thing when Shimon sells the Brooklyn Bridge for $1 million to Reuven. I sold him the Brooklyn Bridge, and people know it's a public sale. So if someone else is going to buy property from Shimon, they're going to do a search and see what other properties has Shimon sold off that he's on the hook for, in case the sale was not a valid sale, and the next buyer will be cautious. But in this situation, there's no way to know what the appreciation that Reuven put into the Brooklyn Bridge for a future buyer to protect himself from Shimon, and that's the reason why when Reuven collects whatever he invested and whatever he appreciated, he can't collect from encumbered property. So Amrle Rabbi Abba Le'ula v'hamazon ha'isha v'habanos de'kaman diksivi damu ketani ein motziin. But what are you going to say about the case of a woman's ksuva? In that situation, it's since it's a rabbinic takana, it's as if it's implicitly written, and there too, we also don't give a person a right to. A woman can't collect for herself or her daughters from encumbered property of the husband. So Amrle hasam mi'ikara hachi. And he says, because that was the original rabbinic takana. The original rabbinic takana is that we entitle a woman to collect from the husband's assets, but only the unencumbered assets, not the assets that he's already sold off. That was like That was the nature of the original takana, and why we'll see momentarily. V'chein Amar Rabbi Asi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan Lefi shein ksuvin, because it's not recorded. And by the way, the Rashi tells us, he gives us an advance notice. He says, you know what, the reason is very simple. If you're going to tell me that any family man is indebted to his wife to the point where whatever he sells is potentially indebted to his wife and his children, then no one's going to want to buy property from a family man, because we don't know what his obligations are to his family. So we'll buy it one day, and then the next day his wife will come running and take the property away from us. So it's not fair. So Amar le Rabbi Zera le Rav Asi v'hamazon ha'isha v'habonos dekman d'chsivi damu katani ein motzin. The same question he asks: how can you tell me that when you have a person who has rights of collection, when Shimon buys the Brooklyn Bridge, he can go back to Ruvain, but he can't collect for appreciation value for moving from encumbered property. He can only collect the original purchase price. What about the Ksuva Venisha? Why not? There too, it's as if it's written in a shtar. It's as if it's written in a shtar, and yet we still don't give her the right to do that. The same answer, the same question, the same answer. Rabbi Chanina says, I have a different answer. You want to know why when Reuven buys the Brooklyn Bridge and he appreciates it, he can only get the original purchase price back from encumbered property, but he cannot get the appreciation value from encumbered property? It's because it's a non-defined amount, not because it's not written in the shtar, but rather because it's a completely non-finite number. And if it's a non-finite number, how can anyone possibly protect themselves from an investment that they may have to default on without knowing what the value of the previous creditor's investment is? He says, So the last question we'll leave you with is, according to Rabbi Chanina, when we say that according to Rabbi Chanina, it's because it's a non-finite number, does that mean that Rabbi Chanina says that you need to have both a finite number and it has to be recorded in a shtar in order for someone to be able to go after encumbered property? Or, as long as it's a finite number, even if it's not recorded in a shtar, does a creditor have a right to go after encumbered property? That's the question that we're going to leave with, and we're going to discuss it tomorrow.